Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Keith. I am your host for today, where we're talking about Endymion, because it's Sunday. So I am excited about that. Got up to chapter 35 today, so we have quite a bit of plot and ground to cover. Just want to take this opportunity to, again, sing the praises of Dan Simmons, who is consistently, at every turn, able to write a compelling novel, both in narrative and in, well, not both in, but in narrative form, in philosophical form, in metaphysics, and also in, like, straight-up science fiction action and, like, cliffhanger type stuff. It's just busted how impressive the writing is in this novel, if I'm being honest. There's a particular scene where it's depicted from two different points of view, but like we are led to believe that Endymion is dead for about almost a whole chapter. Maybe not a whole chapter, but like in the audiobook for a good half hour, I was like, Rawl is dead. So it was pretty annoying, but also like an incredible work of authorship. Regardless, I guess we'll get right into the plot of what's happened in the last couple weeks. So last that we had checked in with our ragtag group of heroes, quote unquote, they had Nia, Rawl, and Abetic had traveled through the Farcaster portal on the planet they were on previously, which they did not know where it was, to a new planet called Mare Infinitum, which is a giant ocean planet, and basically the whole thing is an ocean, which is cool in some regard. But giant ocean means giant fish and giant sharks and things of that nature that aren't so great. So, there's a little bit of a run-in with those. But they translate to Mare Infinitum. They find out that it's definitely still populated with Pax troops. And so what's-his-face, Rawl, Endymion, decides he's going to go and do some reconnaissance at like a floating platform to see what it would take for them to get past said platform. And when he gets there, he is captured, and apparently accidentally leaves his comm channel on the whole time, which is just a hilarious gaffe on his part. But leaves his comm channel on the whole time, gets captured. He's not quite arrested, but not quite but not quite free. But we'll get to that after we do the discussion of the chapter that follows immediately his capture. So we open up this week's particular plot, I guess, with a chapter on Father Captain DeSoya and his ship. And it seems that when he had originally left the previous planet that he was on in Renaissance Vector, they had plotted out 200 possible worlds that were on the like map, if you will, of places that the Farcaster portals could lead to. That had the river. Gosh darn it! Why did I just say River Thebes? It's not the River Thebes. The river that's super important that they're following. I can't remember its name right now for the life of me. But Tynes, Kynes, Fines, Rhines. I don't remember. Anyway, so they're on this river, and they, if you remember correctly, they entered the river's course on Renaissance Vector. But what they find out is that the Farcaster portals, or what we find out as readers, everyone else seems to know this, is that those Farcaster portals are only to one location, hypothetically speaking. What we find out as we're traveling with Ania is that those Farcaster portals are in fact not to just one location, they're to multiple locations. It's just that they were only to one location for humans. Because the Farcaster portal network is controlled by the Technocore. Like, there are no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The Technocore is the one who's in charge of the Farcaster network, and because the Technocore kind of has this weird, omnipresent type set of powers in the Hejira days, because of the Farcaster network, they have these powers. They're basically able to make it so that anyone who's traveling through the Farcaster portal only goes to one location, but that doesn't mean that the Farcaster portals actually only go to one location. It's pretty clear, or it's made pretty clear to us as readers, that most of the Technocore's technology and interaction with humans was done very disingenuously, would be the best word to describe it. So, not entirely sure there, or I am entirely sure there, that there is a reason. I don't know what the reason is that they wanted these Farcaster portals to be able to go wherever. I find it interesting that there hasn't been any mention of how it is that the Technocore seems to know or interact with Ania, because it seems pretty clear to me that she's interacting with him in some capacity that she's just not informing anyone else about. In general, I would guess that she's interacting with a lot more things than she's informing people about, because she seems to have a lot of knowledge that just other people don't have. But anyway, the Farcaster portals, as far as Father Captain de Soya are concerned, only take the people to one of 200 possible locations. So basically, he maps out the other 199 possible locations from Renaissance Vector, and has decided that he's going to start just traveling to them one by one, according to whatever the most efficient way of getting there is. And so he first travels to, I can't remember which world he travels to first, but he gets there, and basically they don't find anything. The river is still there. The Farcaster portal remnants are still there, but it's not necessarily I guess, a good spot for them to have landed. Originally, his plan relied on them translating into hyperspace or whatever it is that they go into in order to travel as close to faster than light speeds as they can get. Whatever process that involves causes them to die. So every time they die, they have to be resurrected, which takes 3 days. And when they're resurrected, they have to be there for 3 days, and then after that, he only planned on being there for another 1 day. So basically, the plan was translate, wake up, do a thing, leave. Translate, wake up, do a thing, leave. But the translation process through space, I guess there's multiple instances where they have to stop so that they can be resurrected and then leave again and die, and then there's a lot of death. And so the chapter opens up with basically just talking about how they're tired of death, which I think is a really funny, I guess ironically poetic way of depicting someone, I guess, doing anything. It's kind of an interesting take on the idea of Sisyphus, which I bring up all the time on this podcast because it is just such a universal storytelling mechanic the idea of like constantly doing the same thing over and over again with the same results, knowing you're going to get the same results, and never like trying to move beyond those because all that you're capable of doing is getting those same results. So like, I think it's pretty interesting and like just great storytelling on Simmons' part to include like death as part of the Sisyphean struggle that these people go through because they have the cruciform and they basically just get revived ad nauseum, which the claim is that the cruciform no longer will take elements of who you are when you die and are revived because of like some sort of thing that the Pax has figured out. But I'm starting to not believe that. I actually think that the original Pecora that Father DeRay finds are the crew of Father Captain DeSoya's ship. And so they are because time travel is involved pretty heavily in this world, right? So I think that somehow or some way, Father Captain DeSoya, in his determination to capture what's-her-face, Ania, decides that he's going to go time travel with his crew back to Hyperion before she's there so that they can capture her before she escapes. But what happens is they go way too far into the past and just start dying over and over again, and then they end up becoming the Pecora with the perfect crew ship. Or everybody who's in all the dead bodies that they found in the labyrinth are like failed members or members of the previous Pecora's numbers that the Pecora killed off as time went on. Not entirely sure, but I feel like there's going to be something cyclical there. I feel like half of the point of these last two books is just to be like, hey, look at all this neat time travel stuff I was able to figure out how to loop everything together by Simmons, which is fine by me. I'm more than happy to read all of it, but still, that is one of my predictions for sure about this book, is that the Pecora end up being Father Captain DeSoya and his ship. I honestly might go listen to the first book again, just that first chapter, to see if there's any details in the story about the Pecora that would make that would kind of connect the two, because it's been so long since I've read that first book. You might forget, but regardless, Captain DeSoya does his thing, dies a few times, gets tired of dying. Sisyphean struggle with death, where it's like, I just die and wake up again. Oh God! And then they finally get to the place that they're trying to go. And what DeSoya realizes is that it takes 8 days in system, minimum, for them to even get to a point where they've actually searched for Ania and to see if she'd even been there yet. Because he's got this papal disc key, but everybody wants to know why he has the papal disc key, and then tests to make sure that it actually does what he says it does, and then they have to communicate with the Vatican and all this stuff, which is just interesting that the Vatican didn't send out a memo or something. But I guess there's no intergalactic email office or anything like that to send things through. But regardless, it's just funny because it takes him 8 days to get anything accomplished at this first place, and a bunch of it is just bureaucratic nonsense that he is just super fed up with. So that's the first hiccup in his plan, is that he's not going to be able to travel as fast or as far as he would like to, as quickly as he would like to do so. And then the second hiccup in his plan is that, I don't know if there's a second hiccup after that. Well, I guess there is kind of a second hiccup. So after they leave the first planet, which I can't remember which one it was, I want to say it's God's Grove or something like that. But they end up going to Heaven's Gate, which, as we remember, is the planet that was terraformed by Martin Silenus. Not him exclusively, but he was a part of the terraforming process there. And when he gets there, what he finds is that, the Tethys River, that's what it is, Thebes, Tethys, that makes sense. What he finds is that there is no river, there's no water. It's just basically this bubbling, acidic mud that would, instantly kill and, not degenerate, but, break down and essentially digest your bones so there wouldn't be any remnants left. Yeah, decompose, that's the word I'm looking for, yeah. So basically the environment's way too harsh for anyone to have traveled through there. So we're going to keep talking about Father Captain DeSoya's travels through space to try and find Ania. That'll be right after this quick commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Alrighty, everybody, we are back to the things that we were talking about previously, and they are fun things and cool things about the book Hyperion. So right before the break, I had just lightly mentioned that there was a bit of an issue with some of the travel plans that Father Captain DeSoya had made for himself and his crew on his way to, what's it called? Gosh darn it. On his way to finding Ania, he goes to Heaven's Gate. On Heaven's Gate, he finds out that the planet has pretty much, reverted back to its original form. Not completely, obviously, because it's still more hospitable than it had been, before it was terraformed. But, for the most part, a lot of the River Tethys is just gone. The Farcaster portals, I think, were still there, but there's just, acidy mud. So he sets up a bunch of motion sensors just to make sure that if something comes through the portals, he'll know. And I think there's cameras as well, probably with a feed to some place or another. It's the future. I'm sure that there are things. So he sets that up, and then as he's leaving, he's like, well, what if they were already there and then she died? And then the people there basically tell him, if they had been through here and died, then we wouldn't even be able to find their remains because the soil here is so acidic that things decompose, almost instantaneously. So it would have been pretty much just hey, we're here. Oh, I'm dying. Oh, I'm dead. And then they're gone. So there's that. And then in addition to that, Father Captain DeSoya finally expresses that he believes that there are other people who are working with Ania. Up to this point, he doesn't know about Rawl and Endymion and the fact that Rawl is working with Ania and a Bedek in order to, accomplish whatever it is that their goal is. Hasn't really been made clear what Ania's goal is exactly. But regardless, Father Captain DeSoya doesn't know that there are two other people with her. Though I guess I do use the word people semi-liberally because a Bedek is an android, which is kind of like a quasi-robot. So, yeah. We find out that he is finally kind of putting two and two together, if you will. And so he leaves Heaven's Gate and decides to go to, drumroll, you guessed it, Mare Infinitum, because this book would have absolutely no tension to it if he never caught up with them. I mean, I'm sure that Dan Simmons, since he is a great writer, and the point of the book, I don't believe is for the main narrative and the hero's journey to end in failure. At least I'm not totally sure if it is, but we'll find out, I guess. If they had never run into each other, then it would have just been this constant, okay, well, I went to this planet and it sucked, and I went to this planet and it was okay, but look at all the bureaucracy I had to go through in order to get things done. And so they arrive on Mare Infinitum, and they go through the standard PAX procedure stuff, which is going to solicit them normally, just a standard visit. But what what happens is that as they're going through their visit, they happen upon a basically like a member of the military who's like a quasi tour guide who's like taking them around the planet, showing them where the Farcaster portals are. We find out that the Farcaster portals have moved substantially. And I forgot to mention this, but on one of the previous planets that they had been to, the Farcaster portals that were supposed to be there were no longer there and had hypothetically been destroyed. Not entirely sure what the implication is there, because Captain DeSoya is kind of hesitant to believe that they've been destroyed, because as we know, it's like nearly impossible to destroy Farcaster portals. You can destroy like Farcaster nexuses that float out in space, and that would get rid of like the overall like Farcaster network, but there's no way to destroy the portals like individually from the materials that they're made out of. They're just, the way that they're constructed is nearly indestructible. So it just doesn't, and there's a bunch of like weird security measures put in place by the Techno Corps in order for them to like make sure that the Farcasters don't get destroyed. Because if we remember, the Farcaster network is like the main network of consciousness, if you will, of processing power for the Techno Corps. So they made it really difficult to destroy the Farcaster portals, but these portals are gone. If I had to guess, the Farcaster portals Farcast portaled themselves somewhere. I'm not entirely sure how that would work, but I would guess that the Techno Corps did something to move those portals to other planets so that it would benefit Ania and Endymion and Abetic. But that also in itself is problematic, because that implies that they knew of Ania, Abetic, and Endymion's existence in the future. But, you know, as we know, timelines are pretty convoluted here. There's definitely at least 2 or 3 individuals who traveled into the future, including the Weintraubs, who get brought up in these few chapters, including the Weintraubs who travel into the future and are able to warn people about certain things, or like tell people about things that happened in the past, which is part of the reason why I think that DeSoya and his crew might end up becoming the Pecora, because they end up being put into the past somehow. Not totally sure exactly how that would work, but like I said, we'll find out. Regardless, he goes to Mare Infinitum, and as they're traveling around, it seems kind of benign. They're like, oh yeah, nothing weird has happened here. And so I'm thinking like, okay, did they beat, because timelines are all weird in this book, so did Captain DeSoya beat them to Mare Infinitum, and are we going to run into him now? Or did they go to Mare Infinitum and already leave, and he's getting there after? Are they there at the same time? There's really no answer that Simmons gives at the beginning of the chapter where, or at least of the part where he's talking about Father DeSoya going to Mare Infinitum. So we're kind of left in the dark in a really interesting and, I guess, quote-unquote fun way. But because they go to Mare Infinitum, and because DeSoya goes to Mare Infinitum and all of that, we find out that... Sorry, I got a little off track. So as he's at Mare Infinitum, he runs into this guy who gives him basically a tour. They're flying around, and they're just kind of letting him talk, and they're getting a little bit bored. They find out that the Farcaster portals have moved due to tectonic shifts, because the Farcaster portals aren't attached to the ground, because the seafloor is so deep down on this ocean planet. They find out that they're attached to these anchors that are attached to... I don't know if I'd call them anchors. It's basically like these big weights that are then attached to drag anchors. And so like there's some sort of like density thing that keeps it afloat and keeps the Farcaster portals vertical. But because the tectonic plates have shifted and the anchors are drag anchors and not just like regular anchors, the Farcaster portals have moved. So instead of being like a few kilometers or 100 kilometers apart, they're like 200 kilometers apart. So it's the largest gap that Ania and the gang, if you will, are able to or have run into and think that they'll run into on the river Tethys at all. So we find that out. And then as they're kind of like going back to base, what they the tour guide starts talking about the most recent incident of poaching, because he starts talking about fishing there, because fishing is one of the most popular sports on the planet. It is like basically their whole economy. Is all these off-world fishermen come in to capture these fish that can like eat a whole boat in one bite. And so they kind of like trick them, and they get these gigantic Leviathan-like fish out of the water somehow. I don't know. It sounds kind of silly, and I'm wondering exactly how it is that they accomplish this task without like dying. I don't know. It doesn't sound much like fishing. It would sound more like hunting, but I don't even know. I don't know how it works. Dan Simmons doesn't explain it, which is fine. The fact that he doesn't explain it makes me more apt to believe it. But regardless, he mentions that there's a lot of poachers who are natives who don't want off-world fishermen coming in and like interfering with the way that things have been done in the past. And so he mentions this one particular poacher who snuck onto a platform, because as they're flying by that platform, it's been damaged. And if you remember correctly, Rawl and Endymion set like C4 remote charges on the platform that he was captured on before he went to do the reconnaissance, so that he could use it as a distraction. What he didn't realize is how much damage it was going to do. But Father Captain DeSoya sees this from the thopter that they're flying around in, and asks about it. And the guy says, "Oh yeah, there was this poacher, and he came in and then blew stuff up, and then they supposedly they killed him, and that was it. But it was really weird. He was flying on a flying carpet," basically is what he says. And DeSoya goes, "Turn around," because they're flying back to the ship that DeSoya arrived on. Immediately following DeSoya complaining about the fact that his ship is not robotic, which would have sped things up. But, you know, robots not cool in the eyes of the Catholic Church, so that's not going to happen. But DeSoya says, "Turn around, we got to go back." So he goes back and starts interviewing literally everybody at the base to try and find out, one, what happened to the guy on the mat, and two, what happened to the mat. And so he starts interviewing everybody, and we don't really get to hear much of his discussion with other members of the crew, or the individuals stationed there. But what we do find out is that the captain of that whole, I don't want to call it a crew, but the captain of the troops who are stationed there, the guy who's in charge, is the one that we kind of watch get interviewed. And what we find out is that on that night that Rawl and Endymion was captured, he tries to escape, and in his attempt to escape, shoves a man overboard, and then starts to escape on his mat, and then decides to turn around and fly back after the detonators have gone off, and then after he starts flying back, he gets shot down by a bunch of flechette pistols, and supposedly the Hawking mat, according to the captain of the base, is lost. And then they go and retrieve the body of the person who they believe is the poacher. They go to find that body in the ocean after they shot it down, and they find that most of it's been eaten by rainbow sharks. So rainbow sharks seem to be like a native bioluminescent shark, which how it would benefit a shark to be bioluminescent doesn't make any sense to me, but I guess maybe on this planet it does make sense. I don't know, Dan Simmons, a glowing predator doesn't seem very interesting, or it doesn't seem very logical according to the evolutionary standards that we know of. But hey, you know what? You do you. If you want there to be bright, shiny rainbow sharks, I really appreciate it. But regardless, we find out pretty quickly, or we get the suspicion that pretty quickly that the captain isn't telling the truth. And we get that suspicion because Father Captain DeSoya is pretty sure that this guy's not telling the truth. So, we're going to talk about the twist right after this next quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching.
Hey!
The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
We were talking about how there's a little bit of suspicion surrounding the story of the captain on the platform that Captain Father DeSoya is visiting on Mare Infinitus. And the captain starts to say, like, oh, I have, this is what happened the night that the guy was here. We shot him down, and the mat was disappeared. And the captain... there's this interesting interaction between Father Captain DeSoya and this captain, where Father Captain DeSoya has interviewed literally everybody on the platform because, he's trying to basically find a needle in a haystack at this point. And so he's just kind of like totally lost in whether or not he's going to actually find her is still completely up in the air because, she's clearly very difficult to find. You're talking about it's not like, imagine looking for someone on Earth and not knowing where they are. But DeSoya is chasing her across like the galaxy, basically like every planet that could possibly exist and hold life. He's kind of following her along on. Well, not quite. He hasn't realized that that Ania and Abetic and what's his face can travel to places that didn't have Farcaster portals for the River Teeth as previously. They haven't realized that yet, but we'll get there. I think that in some way the Techno Core, because of their ability, and this is something that I didn't mention, or that I touched on earlier, the Techno Core kind of made a living off of their ability to predict things, and so they were kind of always concerned with predicting the future, figuring out the outcomes of conflicts. One of the main reasons that Maynard Gladstone is even willing to get into a war with the Ousters in the original Hyperion novel is because she hears from the Techno Core that the chances of their success are, within a certain amount, and that there's going to be this number of casualties, and you're going to see these things result in these things. And so she decides to enter into the war with that knowledge. So it's kind of like the Techno Core is in a way capitalizing on the ability that they have to do math, which is funny because like Hyperion apparently represents an unknown variable within their algorithm. That's the word I'm looking for. Within their algorithm for the galaxy to figure out what's going to happen to the human race, if they're going to extinguish themselves, if they're going to do this or that. So it's a big deal whenever the Technocore is wrong, but it's also kind of a big deal when they're right in some regards. Not totally sure exactly how they do the things that they do, and why they're doing the things that they're doing. The AIs have their own god that they made, and if their god exists in the same capacity as the human god, then it's outside of time, so it knows everything, but they can communicate with it because it's theirs. Not totally sure exactly how that works. There's some weird mysticism type thing that's happening here. Like I've mentioned before, Dan Simmons seems to at least maybe have some familiarity with the philosophic systems of Maimonides, because he talks specifically about the idea of spheres and the datasphere, metasphere, and megasphere. So I think that there might be some influence there, which is why there's like this kind of mystical element to religiosity in this book. But regardless of all that, back to the interaction between Father Captain DeSoya and the captain of the platform, whose name I don't think we actually get. He's described as like a very large, pudgy man who seems very like content to sit on his laurels and enjoy his post rather than do anything special, and very content to just kind of kill poachers. It seems, according to DeSoya, that's like the most exciting thing that happens around here, is that they get to kill some poachers every now and then. That's neither here nor there necessarily. So Father Captain DeSoya asks the man, like, so this is the story that you're sticking with. And Dan Simmons goes into this little interaction between the two of them that I think's worthy of note, where he says the captain looks at DeSoya and knows that DeSoya knows that the captain knows that DeSoya has spoken to everybody on the platform. So basically, DeSoya has spoken to everybody on the platform, and DeSoya knows that the captain knows this. And so there's this weird pause of like, okay, what part of this story isn't adding up for DeSoya, because the fact that this guy pauses and has to contemplate his answer implies that like something funky happened. And what's funny, the first place that I jumped to was, oh, well, they got Rawl, and somehow Ania finds out that Rawl is captured, and then Ania comes, and we finally get to see like what it is that Ania has to offer to everybody that the Pax are so afraid of. And these guys are all like converted away from Christianity and converted to whatever it is that Ania is promoting, and that's why he's lying. But that wasn't why he was lying. What we find out is that the body that they recovered is not able to be confirmed as being anyone in particular. We do find out that part of the story is true. So the story basically is that Rawl is captured, and they start to try to take him into custody, and they succeed in getting him in handcuffs at least, but he ends up running away. And in the process of running away, he pushes somebody off of the platform and into the water. And then that guy falls into the water. And then Rawl ends up running through like a bunch of different rooms and diving out a window and going from the roof down to where he had the hawking mat. And now he had never intended to actually blow up the charges unless he had to. So he didn't at that point. He still hasn't blown up the charges at that point. And but this is all after. So the captain says, we got a body and we don't have the mat. Well, DeSoya says that's not the story that we were told by this guy. This guy told us that you did get the mat and you have it here. And so DeSoya orders a Swiss guard to bust open this guy's storage locker, and sure enough, the mat is in there, and Dan Simmons does this amazing thing where he tells us, yeah, the mat is covered in blood and ripped to shreds by flechette guns. There's exposed wiring. The patterns are covered by blood. There's no way for it to be usable still. And that in itself, to me, was like, oh, wow, I think Rawl may actually be dead. Because there's something about like the kind of bookendedness of the story revolving around this, or part of the Hyperion story revolving around this particular item from the beginning of the novel. There's something that feels very right about that. So when Simmons puts that it's no longer in the possession of our protagonist, but is now in the possession of our main antagonist, it just feels very final in some regard, that like, oh, something about this book is changing right now. Something about this story is about to take a turn that is very harsh in direction away from what the rest of the book has been about. And so that in itself was kind of like a really big cliffhanger. So the Captain Father DeSoya, of course, arrests the captain who lied to him, and basically says, like, this flying carpet, this hawking mat is the first piece of a large puzzle that I'm going to figure out, and when I figure it out, I will be able to capture Ania. And so now it kind of feels like he's reinvigorated in some capacity to continue his search for Ania, but it's also confirmed to him that there are or was at least one other person with her on her journey, and that in itself is valuable information for De Soya. So that's kind of where we leave off with Captain De Soya. So immediately after he says, once I have the puzzle, I'm going to find you, then we jump to the next chapter, which is finally Rawl's point of view from when he was initially captured, which the fact that we had to read through a whole chapter of not Rawl's story of getting captured drove me insane. I was definitely not thrilled about that in any regard. So Rawl is in the process, or he's in the process of trying to avoid capture. So he is acting as if he came with one of the fishing parties that's currently on the platform. The people who are working the platform, who are Pax military, I believe, quickly find out that he is in fact not with either of the parties that he's claiming to be with. And there's this specific little scene that I thought was really funny where Rawl walks into the cafeteria and he mentions that the whole place reeks of this specific type of masculine bonding, masculine adventure-based bonding, I think is what he calls it, where the idea that I'm getting from Simmons is like there's a specific type of bonding that men who hunt and men who fish go through that is like kind of vapid in some way because it's tied to an activity and not tied to who the other person is as an individual. And it felt, honestly, in a really weird way, it felt a little petulant on Simmons' part because it felt like he was like I could almost hear Simmons being like, yeah, these people get to hang out with each other all the time because they like the same stupid stuff like hunting and fishing, which is ultimately not very valuable. And it felt like almost like he was kind of making a point to say like, oh, I got left out of these things, so like they're kind of dumb. Or in some regard, I think it might be part of just developing Rawl's character, because Rawl seems to not have any value for the types of men that he used to guide when he was a duck hunting guide on Hyperion. I mean, from the very onset of the book, we could kind of tell that Rawl was not about these very wealthy men who hunted other things for sport, which, you know, aside from my interpretation of Dan Simmons being a little petulant about it, the fact of the matter is that a lot of this book has depicted the idea of hunting or poaching or fishing even as not being very desirable. It's depicted generally negatively from what I can tell. I think that in part is contributing to this idea that I don't think Simmons thinks of human beings as being very special in regards to their relation to other things, other organisms. I think that there's kind of this like universalist ideal that Dan Simmons is trying to get at, where he's trying to say like, we hunt and fish for sport because we think that we're above the other organisms in the universe around us. We don't do like when we hunt and we don't eat the creature, or we like eat it but still taxidermy it. Like those are wasted resources that are supposed to stay within like a circle of life of some sort. And so for me, I think that there's a lot of clear commentary that would work to both develop Rawl's character, maybe portray a little bit of Simmons' real-life experience, but also just to emphasize Simmons' kind of metaphysic view on the value of hunting and fishing and those types of things. So I thought that it would be interesting to kind of mention that and explore that idea just a little bit. So Endymion gets found out pretty quickly that he's not in either party, and so they put handcuffs on him. And he specifically mentions that they're like old-fashioned handcuffs, which I think is funny that those are still being used. And he says, I guess these will be sufficient for now, basically. And then he decides that he's going to figure out a way to run away. And in that process, like I mentioned earlier, he knocks a lieutenant over the edge who falls down into the ocean. And then Endymion turns around, runs through that same mess hall, and jumps out a window and starts to roll down this roof, which is like this tempered steel roof, so it's not very advanced. somehow manages to not get cut by glass after diving through a window, and then hangs on this ledge for a little while until he can figure out how it is that he's going to get down to his hawking mat, which he somehow gets down to, and then begins to fly away. And I will talk more about what happens after that right after this quick commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
So right before the break, I was just kind of generally talking about what exactly was going on in regards to the situation with Endymion and his attempt at escape from the platform that he was, I don't want to say like stuck on, but he had been kind of like captured on. So he rolls down jumps out the window and rolls down the roof, and then gets to his hockey mat and starts to fly away. And while he's flying away, he sees the lieutenant that he had knocked off the platform in the water being attacked by sharks. And he debates back and forth of like, oh, should I go back and get this guy? Whatever. And ultimately he decides to go back and like get this guy out of the water rather than just let him get eaten by sharks. And the guy responds to his kindness by immediately stabbing him, which is sad. Because I was almost hopeful for a second that like something about the world would be like nice, or that like Pax soldiers weren't all going to be these like weirdly evil individuals, but the fact of the matter is that they are, which is not great, but kind of is what it is, unfortunately. So, the Pax soldier gets into this melee fight with him, and this is where like Dan Simmons really starts to shine as an author outside of just like a science fiction high art type guy. The depiction that Simmons gives of the combat is very similar to, but even more refined than the combat between, gosh darn it, Kassad. Yeah, Kassad. Between Kassad and the Shrike back from the Fall of Hyperion. Which is really good because that writing was like amazing, and then we get this like, it feels like every single one of these books at some point has some like very tense action scene in it that kind of, I don't want to say sets the tone for the rest of the book, but like reestablishes tension for the book, because there's a lot of conflict between characters in the universe and the setting around them, but there's not a lot of direct conflict for the characters. And so every like these punctuated action scenes feel very intentional in their placement and in the style that they're written, to kind of force us into being like, oh, this is where something important, or this is where the tension kind of gets reestablished and things start to move a little bit more from here. It happened in the first book when Kassad had his vision about fighting on the side of the Shrike with Moneta, and it happened in the Fall of Hyperion when he actually ends up fighting the Shrike with Moneta. And now it's happened in this book with Endymion and his journey after being captured. So he fights with the guy who's on the hawking mat, and that guy has a knife, which gives him a clear advantage. And Endymion takes this random moment to think about how awful human beings are to each other and how much he hates bladed weapons, because he's used them so frequently as a tool to, like, you know, gut a fish, clean a bird, etc. And he is just kind of flabbergasted at the fact that people are so willing to use them in hand-to-hand combat with each other. And because he's handcuffed, he's at a heavy disadvantage, and he can't pull out the gun that he had, which is Bron Lamia's pistol, if you remember correctly, which is just a, you know, obviously would basically be he'd win the fight. But he ends up losing to this gentleman who he saved, and that guy stabs him in the chest and slashes him across the arm pretty heavily and knocks him off the hawking mat. Rawl Endymion falls into the ocean and then watches as the hawking mat starts to drift up and back towards the platform. And then he watches as the platform open fires on their own dude, who gets basically split into a million pieces because the flechette pistols are basically like grenades full of little miniature blades. Endymion mentions specifically needles, but basically flechette rounds are designed to tear flesh from bone and, you know, stop a very large organism from moving, or it basically to stop their momentum as well. So it just is. It's like if you put glass shards in a shotgun, is kind of how I've interpreted it. So that guy gets ripped to pieces and falls in the ocean, which is great for Endymion because all that blood distracts the sharks, but only for a small period of time, because eventually the sharks start to catch up with Endymion, and then we get this very long, well, not very long, but just longer than I wanted it to be, journey of Endymion basically drifting at sea with salt water seeping into his wounds, where he's trying to, like, fight off these sharks. And he mentions this specific, he starts going through, like, kind of like the stages of, I guess, like, religious conflict, where he's like, how could a God that made, or how can a God be merciful and loving if it made a world that tortured, where all of the creations within that world torture each other like this? Because he's stranded in the middle of this ocean planet with nowhere to go. No one knows where he is. And he can't hardly swim because he's lost so much blood, and he's still losing blood. And on top of that, there are these sharks, these mindless creatures, trying to eat him just for the sake of eating him. Not because they have any moral interest in anything like that. There's just these giant maws of teeth and a stomach to digest his remains in. And so he has this specific memory of a poem by Stephen Crane, which, why in the world he would know a poem by Stephen Crane that's like almost 1,000 years old is beyond me. I guess his grandma, I don't remember what he calls her, grandna or something like that. But actually, I think it's a woman. I'm not sure. Grandma, I believe. But she read this poem to him where this guy goes through all the stage, or these gentlemen go through a bunch of stages of, like, reasoning with God, questioning God, and ultimately coming to the conclusion that, like, God must not care, which would kind of fit Stephen Crane's MO based off of the time at which he would have been writing. So Endymion kind of goes through that same thing, but doesn't come to any conclusions. But I do find it interesting that the character who is so far been most vehemently against the idea of a cruciform, or the idea of getting a cross, starts wondering about God. And especially in conjunction with the next place that they all end up going. Yes, he lives, obviously, or we wouldn't have the rest of the book, and he's been very clear that he is still alive because he's the one telling the story. But at least he's telling the portions that involve Ania and himself and Abetic. But it's funny that he's the one who's going through all of these questions, and he doesn't end up coming to any conclusions, but I think that's in part just because he has to spend so much time fighting the sharks off. The sharks are rainbow sharks, like I mentioned before. They're bioluminescent sharks that are very similar in operation to most sharks on Earth. He kicks them in the nose to keep them away from him. So I find it interesting that Simmons would assume that similar life develops across the galaxy, throughout the universe. Similar organisms evolve in similar fashions on other planets. So I find that interesting. I also find it interesting that it's just sharks and not like a Leviathan or something huge. But I suppose that if it was, as long as it's just sharks, there's something that Endymion can at least kind of do about it. So he floats around for a while and eventually starts to give up and starts to be like, hopeful that Ania's going to show up randomly out of nowhere for no reason because she has no idea where he is. So there's no way that she could find him. And I should mention, in the process of him fighting and getting stabbed, when the guy stabs him, Endymion dodges it, but the knife still, stabs him. Instead of killing him, it just wounds him. And in that process of being wounded, the guy hits the detonator with the knife. So kind of in an ironic way, the guy kills himself because if that explosion hadn't happened, then when the Hawking mat starts flying back, they're probably not nearly as aggressive with firing at it rather than letting it land. So because the explosion happened, he gets shot down by his own men. So he kind of like gets saved by Endymion, and then in his fighting against being saved ends up killing himself, which I find to be hilarious. And of course, I'm sure that irony is not lost on Simmons. That was absolutely intentional. So I guess there is kind of like some sort of karma that happens there, but I don't think that Simmons is necessarily advocating for that. Regardless, so that happens, and then Endymion is floating, and finally he feels something on the back of his neck, and he thinks that he just got bit because he's already been bit once, and the shark tore off a substantial amount of flesh and skin. But it actually ends up being Ania, who is tied to a Bedek, who a Bedek swims up with a giant machete and kind of goes all Rambo on a couple of sharks, which is awesome because I've been waiting for a Bedek to be a BA for this whole book. They end up getting him back to the raft and going through the Farcaster portal. And when they go through the Farcaster portal, because they get him back on the raft, realize he's lost a ton of blood, open up a med pack, start pumping him full of plasma, like blood plasma, suturing his wounds, etc. And eventually, Ania has to knock him out because he's in so much pain and his body's in so much shock that they can't get his vitals stable, which is like you have to get healing started. You need stable vitals. That's just, those two things go hand in hand with each other. So Ania knocks him out with Ultraform, which was mentioned for Father Hoyt back in the first book, and they end up going through the Farcaster portal while he's unconscious, and he wakes up, and they are on Hebron, which is the homeworld of the Jews. And I just think it's ironic that they go to Hebron right after his near-death experience, where he has this questioning of God, because that's a very traditional narrative within like Jewish literature and Jewish religion. Not that those two things are really separable. There is kind of like a little bit of a line, because the religious aspect is usually more like oral than written, and the literature is obviously written. But they end up on Hebron, where Endymion is able to get medical attention from an automated surgery machine that ends up fixing him up. But in the process of them getting him to the hospital, they are all talking about like, okay, well, Hebron is controlled by ousters, so there might be ousters here, so we might have to worry about that, but they're better than the Pax troopers are, so 50-50 shot there. But when they get to the city, they find out that there's nobody there. They reason that eventually that like the people were evacuated in a very timely fashion because there's not even pets left. And Endymion specifically mentions, because he's conscious at this point, that he remembers on the last place where there was a big conflict, there were wild animals and pets that were ravenous and rabid because they had just been abandoned because people didn't have time to take their pets with them. But in this particular city, there's like nothing and no one. So I'm actually kind of quasi-suspicious that they're not even really on Hebron and that they're somewhere in the megasphere or the metasphere, and that when they go to places where there are not Farcaster portals that were on the River Tethys, that it is in fact Ania taking them to the metasphere, and they're just kind of experiencing a meta reality, which would line up with Endymion as a story, as far as the original poem and the original story from the Greek myth are concerned, is that he's kind of constantly in and out of this dream or meta state and reality. So, I'm sure we'll find that out later. There are a few other things that I think I'm going to save for the next episode that get talked about during this portion of the book. But the main thing to know is that they end up leaving Hebron, and when they translate away from Hebron, or when they travel through the Farcaster portal to get off of Hebron, they end up in an ice cavern. And so it's freezing cold, whereas Hebron's a desert planet. They're now on a freezing cold river in the middle of an ice cave, and that's where I'm going to leave us off, because that's where Simmons leaves us off in the book. So I just thank you guys for listening. We got through a lot of material this week, so I hope it wasn't too confusing. I'm sure we'll do another recap episode before we finish the book, but if not, if you're reading the book and I missed anything, let me know in the comments. Let me know what you guys think of some of my thoughts, obviously. Leave us a review. That'd be great. Follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, anywhere else where you get podcasts. Give that like and subscribe button a click if you enjoyed this, and I hope that you guys have enjoyed our journey through Endymion, and I look forward to continuing talking about it next week. Have a great week, everybody.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.